Imagine this. You're on your way to work, your mind buzzing with thoughts of coffee and deadlines. Then, just an hour later, you're in handcuffs, accused of a crime you didn't commit. The judge stares at you like you're already guilty, and your only hope lies in a lawyer who transforms the courtroom into a battlefield. But what happened next? No one could have predicted it. Let's rewind to the beginning. Eleanor James, 60, had spent almost 40 years working as an accountant in Detroit, Michigan. She was in her final year before retirement, eagerly counting down the days until she could leave behind the stress of spreadsheets and deadlines. Born and raised in a modest neighborhood, Eleanor's parents instilled in her the values of honesty and hard work, principles she had lived by her entire life. She took pride in her reputation as someone reliable, trustworthy, and steadfast. So, when she found herself in the back of a police car, accused of grand theft auto, it felt like she had stepped into someone else's nightmare. It all began one Tuesday morning. Eleanor was driving to work in a car borrowed from her neighbor and friend, Lisa Grant, a younger woman who offered the vehicle while Eleanor's own car was being repaired. Lisa's car, a modest silver sedan, was nothing flashy but perfectly functional. Borrowing it seemed harmless. Eleanor never imagined it could lead to her arrest. As she drove down Jefferson Avenue, her mind wandered to the retirement celebration her colleagues were planning. Then, suddenly, she noticed flashing red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. Her heart raced, just like it always did when she encountered the police, but she told herself it was probably just a routine stop. She pulled over, trying to stay calm. The officer approached, his expression stern and unreadable. "License and registration," he demanded. Eleanor, keeping her hands visible, handed over the documents Lisa had given her. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked politely. The officer didn't reply. Instead, he retreated to his cruiser. Minutes later, he returned, this time with two other officers beside him. Eleanor's chest tightened as the tension escalated. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," the officer barked. "What's going on?" Eleanor asked, her voice shaking with alarm. "This car matches the description of a stolen vehicle," he said flatly, as if her guilt was a foregone conclusion. "Stolen? That's impossible. It belongs to my friend. I have her permission to use it," she protested. "Save it," the officer snapped, grabbing her arm and placing her in handcuffs. The humiliation was unbearable. Strangers on the sidewalk stopped to stare, their judgmental looks cutting through her. Hours later, Eleanor sat in a holding cell, her thoughts spiraling. How could this happen? She had lived her life with integrity, always playing by the rules. Now, she was being treated like a criminal. Weeks later, Eleanor found herself in a cold, intimidating courtroom. The walls were lined with strangers who saw her as just another defendant. Her lawyer, Robert Stein, an older, seasoned attorney, was running late, leaving her to face Judge Walter Crane alone. Crane, known for his no-nonsense attitude and harsh sentences, glared down at her as though he'd already decided her fate. "Well, Miss James," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "First time in my courtroom, I presume? Enjoying the experience?" The courtroom chuckled. Eleanor's face burned, but she held her tongue. She couldn't afford to lose her composure. "So, you claim you didn't know the car was stolen. How convenient," Crane sneered. "Perhaps your lawyer will perform a magic trick to convince us next." The crowd laughed again. Eleanor's fists tightened at her sides. She needed Robert to show up, fast. Finally, Robert burst into the room, out of breath and apologetic. Eleanor's hope dwindled. Robert seemed stretched too thin, juggling countless cases and barely familiar with hers. She knew she'd need more than luck to make it through this ordeal. The following day, Eleanor sat nervously at the defense table, her hands clenched tightly. She had no idea who her replacement lawyer would be. Robert had abruptly dropped her case due to a family emergency. Her already fragile faith in the system teetered on the edge. Then, the courtroom doors swung open. Vivien Carter entered, and the room's energy shifted instantly. The sharp click of her heels against the marble floor commanded attention. Vivien, 45, radiated confidence and authority. Dressed in a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, she surveyed the room like a hawk. Even Judge Crane seemed momentarily unsettled. Vivien strode over to Eleanor, setting a thick folder on the table. She offered a calm, reassuring smile and whispered, "Don't worry, Miss James, I've got this." As the trial resumed, Vivien stood tall, her voice slicing through the courtroom with precision. "Your Honor, we must address some glaring issues with this case, starting with the fact that the charges against my client are entirely baseless." The courtroom murmured, and Judge Crane leaned back, smirking. "Miss Carter, tread carefully. This courtroom operates on facts, not theatrics." Vivien tilted her head slightly, her expression sharp. "Facts. That's an interesting choice of words, Your Honor, given how flimsy the prosecution's case is." Crane's smirk faltered. "I don't appreciate your tone. And I don't appreciate the disregard for due process," Vivien countered, her voice rising just enough to command attention. "From the start, my client has been treated as if she's guilty, despite a complete lack of evidence." She began pacing, flipping through the folder. "Let's start with the arrest. The police claim the car was stolen, yet there's no record of the owner, Lisa Grant, ever filing a report. Curious, isn't it? Almost as though conclusions were jumped to without verification." Turning to the audience, Vivien's voice carried authority. "And during the arrest, my client was denied access to legal counsel while being interrogated for hours. Is that standard procedure now?" Judge Crane's gavel struck the bench. "Miss Carter, I suggest you—" "I'm not finished," Vivien interrupted, her tone icy but controlled. "The prosecution has also conveniently ignored dashcam footage that, conveniently, malfunctioned. Thankfully, multiple witnesses recorded the arrest on their phones." The courtroom buzzed with whispers. For the first time in weeks, Eleanor felt a glimmer of hope. Vivien was tearing apart the prosecution's case with surgical precision. Over the next 2 days, Vivien's relentless cross-examinations exposed glaring flaws in the investigation. She called Detective Harris, the arresting officer, to the stand. "Detective," she began, her tone sharp, "can you confirm when you received the report about the alleged stolen vehicle?" Harris hesitated. "We acted on a tip," he mumbled. Vivien raised an eyebrow, her expression unyielding. "A tip? From whom?" "Because there's no record of a formal complaint filed by the vehicle's owner." "So, you arrested my client without evidence and didn't bother to verify the car's ownership?" Vivien's voice was sharp, each word dripping with disdain. The courtroom fell eerily silent, her accusations hanging heavily in the air like a brewing storm. By the time Vivien finished dismantling Detective Harris's testimony, the once confident officer appeared utterly deflated. His earlier assurance had crumbled into pieces. The prosecution's case, which once seemed unshakable, was now in ruins. The final day of the trial arrived, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The audience buzzed with anticipation as Vivien took her place, exuding confidence. Her presence commanded attention as she delivered her closing argument. "Your Honor, members of the court," she began, her voice steady and resolute, "this case isn't about justice. It's about assumptions and bias. My client, a woman with an impeccable record, has been wrongfully accused because the system failed her. This trial isn't just an opportunity to clear her name. It's a chance to challenge the complacency that allowed this injustice to occur. She paused, letting her words sink in, the silence amplifying their weight. It's time to right this wrong. As her voice echoed through the courtroom, the room remained silent, all eyes on Judge Crane as he deliberated. Finally, he lifted his gavel, his expression a mix of frustration and resignation. With a sharp crack that resonated throughout the chamber, he announced, "The court finds the charges against Eleanor James dismissed." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Her hands trembled as she absorbed the judge's words. It was over. She turned to Vivien, her eyes shimmering with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Vivien's stern demeanor softened slightly, though her professionalism remained intact. "You don't need to thank me," she said with a faint smile. "Just remember, this isn't only about you. It's about holding the system accountable." As they stepped into the sunlight outside the courthouse, Eleanor felt a renewed sense of purpose. This victory wasn't just hers. It was a triumph over a flawed system that too often failed those who needed it most. Vivien had done more than defend her. She had shone a light on the cracks in the foundation of justice. Eleanor couldn't help but wonder how many others were out there, waiting for someone like Vivien to fight for them.